what is the difference between a story structure and a formula? Because people seem to be resistant to, we're going to be formulaic. Now, I have an idea like that you can have stories. And to me, when you read The Writer's Journey or The Heroine's Labyrinth or all of this, that we're not a formula. But there are stories, it appears, that are formulaic and are incredibly successful. When I think of a formulaic story, I think of like Home Improvement, that the sitcom from years ago. Like, if you're going to tell a Home Improvement story, we got to start with him on his show. He's got to go talk to his neighbor, which I just escaped my name. But, there's a formula to that story. Or Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. Like, you watch like 100 episodes of Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, you watch the same episode over and over again because it is formula. They fight somebody out of uniform, then they turn into their uniform and whatever. So, but obviously that's very successful in some cases. A formula for a TV show, they hit it and then you make tons of money. But what is the difference? Like, if somebody's saying, no, I can't follow this structure because I don't want to be formulaic, what's the difference between those two and what's the meaning here? You want to go first, Chris?
You want to take that, Doug?
Well, I think you had mentioned it earlier when talking about comic books. Sometimes a formula is a standard mode of operation. The reader or the viewer knows what to expect. I think of actually McDonald's. They say, who can make a better burger than McDonald's? And everyone raises their hand. It's like, well, they're not selling you a better burger. They're selling you something that you can count on, a reliable experience in terms of the taste, food. It's all standardized. It's familiar and it's easy to repeat it. So I think, to me, a formula is something like that. It's not trying to be avant-garde. It's not trying to create art at a certain level, perhaps by subverting everything or trying to do something completely new. They're trying to give you something that you know what you're expecting and you know what you're going to get, and their job is to entertain you for that period of time. But something like Campbell, you're trying to tell a story at a deeper level. So I think, the idea of an archetype is it manifests itself. It expresses itself different in each story. The dragon that is slayed can be, a dragon that's breathing fire in one movie, and then in the next movie, it's a giant Death Star shooting a green laser. Then in the next one, it's a radioactive, iguana shooting radiation out of its mouth. So they're expressed totally differently, but underneath they're the same. And I think a TV show or possibly a comic book run, I don't know if they're trying to do that. I think they're trying to entertain you for a short period of time with something that you've come to expect. That's what I think anyway.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think we can make some distinctions about words that we use to describe the patterns. And some of them have a negative feeling about them, like formula does. When you say something's formulaic, you mean I'm not going to be surprised by anything here. I've seen it before multiple times, and they are simply just turning the crank and doing the same thing again, maybe a little bit bigger this time or in a different location with maybe different actors, but it's exactly the same routine. A maybe better word for what we're talking about is a paradigm, and that was used in the early days. Sid Fields, the great pioneer of story structure, you called it a paradigm, and that's a little bit looser than formula. A word I find useful these days is algorithm. Yes. Although we're not using mathematics, we are confronting situations and studying for ourselves the different ways there are to handle those situations. Somebody gets in a jam, how do they get out of it? That's where the repetition comes, because people get in jams over and over, but also where the difference comes because we can get out of it many, many ways. And what you want is, and this was true in giving notes to people in the studio system on scripts, we would say, here's a problem. The way you solved it is kind of a cliche. And I want to give you 3 different ways you could solve this, but I don't want you to do any one of those. I trust you as a writer. This is what I would say in my notes. And I learned this from Jeffrey Katzenberg, who was the greatest note writer ever. He would say, self-effacingly, I'm not the writer. You're the guys who are getting paid the big bucks, so I trust you. But here are the dumb ways to do it. This is an obvious thing. You could do this. You could do that. Now, you guys go and figure out one I didn't think of. Figure out one you haven't thought of, and that's what keeps the audience surprised and engaged. In my career, I very quickly identified myself as the structure guy because I understood this Campbell thing. But when I worked with the scripts, one by one, Campbell very rarely entered into it formally. It was more a matter of going back to vaudeville, going back to theater, going back to kids playing on a playground and pretending there's something. And what I think was doing was studying and advising them on narrative strategies. And what structure meant to me was not put it in the box of the hero's journey at the beginning. As next, it's called Adventure Must Be between pages 10 and 15 and so forth. It wasn't like that. It was more like in this particular story, you need flashbacks. This is a memory piece. So the structure is going to be a series of events in the present that trigger thinking about the past. And so that becomes your structure, so to speak, your narrative strategy for that particular film. And so it would determine things, a sense of this that I developed would determine things like, do we repeat sequences? Do we go a long time without visiting a character to the point where we almost forget about them? Do we manipulate the cards as we're making our outline for this thing in such a way to keep the urgency going all the time? These are the structural things that on the ground, not in the abstract for the book, but script by script. It was more about that, about what's the best way to tell this story? What's the best way to give this play to the audience? And that's going to be different for everyone. And it's an intuitive thing. You can't really use formulas or even algorithms. This is more about, hey, what's best for this movie?
See, I love that because you just said it too, intuitive. You're leaving room for that creative intuition, which is so vital to stories. I mean, we've all been there as writers where you write something for structure and it sounds like you wrote it structurally. It's like lifeless. It's just the structure. So you have to have that creative intuition. So I love that you just said that.
I just am flashing on a moment in film school when I realized I had this intuitive snapshot ability to take any story and tune it just a little bit so that connections were made better, the audience understood, had better orientation, or something was intensified. And the example was we were in the first week of school and we all had to come up with a pitch. And one guy said, I want to do something with an old man who's at the end of his creative life and he's given up. And then he realizes he has a grandson he didn't know about. And they come and live together and they clash. Okay. So I'm sitting there in the quadrangle, listening to this. And I jumped up and I said, hey, what if the old man and the boy meet each other before they know they're related and they clash? And the little boy runs over his foot with a skateboard or something, and the old man yells at him and chases him off the lawn. And then they find out they're already at odds. But then they find out that's your grandson that you just yelled at. and it immediately, everybody, especially the writer, went, wow, yeah, oh yeah, that would be good. So this is the kind of thing I'm talking about. There are little refinements, and usually, like with my friend who wrote Mary and Mary on the same character, it's latent in the story already. And all I was ever doing as a advisor, as a consultant, was just going, you already said that, man. It's on page 52. Just heap it up a little more. Just shine a little more light on it. And that will pay off better. So that was an awful lot of my structural contribution at the studios was this kind of tuning for maximum effect.
That's awesome.
Are you familiar with John Truby? Sable for $5 had asked, would you say that's along the same lines as Truby's idea of transcending genre by combining two or more genres from the same genre? Because he's big on this idea of transcending a genre in story.
Yeah, John Truby is a frightening genius. He scares me by how thoroughly he slices and dices the genres and analyzes them, much as you have, Doug. You've done a similar job of work. But he hit on something there, which is very real. And we saw this in operation at Disney under Jeffrey Katzenberg, because Katzenberg would say to us in animation, we're going to try to do something with Rumpelstiltskin, but that little fairy tale is not enough. So why don't we combine Rumpelstiltskin with some classic movie like Casablanca? Or It Happened One Night, or Ordinary People. He would slap two things together. And from that would come a much more sophisticated, multi-leveled idea. So I think that's what John Truby may be speaking of, is that you get to take all the things off the rack that people recognize of that genre, and then you bring in a whole raft of other stuff, and then see how they play together. It's a beautiful thing. When I was composing film examples, I just took 2 VCRs back in the day and I record off of one. And I took like 25 different movies and showed, here's 5 calls to adventure. Here's 5 refusals. Here's 5 from all different genres. And the bizarre thing was, the movies started talking to each other, and they made a coherent story out of these fragments.
Oh,
it was an inner skeleton that was universal, and all you had to do was drop something in, and it would just automatically answer the question of the last scene in a completely different genre or a completely different time in black and white. Cary Grant would be asking something in Gunga Din, and then 25 years later, he's in North by Northwest answering his own question.
Oh, man.
It's just this weird, eerie thing. I call it the needle drop, because in editing sound and trying to make something match up to a piece of music, you might look at the finished product and say, wow, how did they adjust everything and cut just exactly at the right point to get the climax? Usually they don't. They just drop the needle on a record. And if you start where the scene starts, it'll reach the climax just by this weird kind of interconnected web-like way that stories have. The scene will come to the climax just when the music does. And I, as you said, Douglas, I trust it. I trust that if you trust, these things will just spontaneously happen, and that's wonderful.
Yeah, what's funny is toward the later stage of studying the Heroine's Labyrinth, I started to get to the point where I would know where to look, and then there it was.
Yes. There's a hole there, so let's find the hole and find what goes in that hole, and trust that there is something there.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be surprised and delighted that it's better. The accidental insight that we've been talking about is usually better than the one you plan and
totally
consciously dream up.